A few years ago, I retired from state service after serving as a senior state archaeologist for California State Parks. For most of my 40-year career, I helped manage the cultural resources found within the state parks of the greater San Francisco Bay Area. That included Angel Island State Park. Angel Island is a landmark that figures in the story of the most famous of the escape attempts from Alcatraz Prison. Over the years, I spent a considerable amount of time conducting archaeological work on Angel Island. I enjoyed working there, and every time I visited, it seemed more like an adventure than work. For example, on this one occasion, I was surveying the hillside above Point Blunt. It was overcast and about to rain, and the wind was coming from the southwest. Lucky for me, I was carrying a raincoat in my day pack. As the rain moved closer, and then was upon me, I took my raincoat out and began to put it on. The raincoat was full length, extending down to below my knees. As I went to put the raincoat on, I was standing near the edge of the cliff and facing San Francisco and Alcatraz. I slipped one arm in a sleeve, and then the other, and then prepared to zip the raincoat up. With both my arms in the sleeves, I adjusted the jacket by arching my back while extending my arms. As I did so, I inadvertently turned into the wind. Almost instantly, my jacket caught the wind and propelled me backwards. Quickly. Backwards. I was surprised at how powerful even a relatively small wind was when captured by my unfurled raincoat. It became an unintentional sail that day. Thankfully, it propelled me away from the cliff rather than over it. Thinking about it later, I found myself wondering if perhaps another raincoat from a half-century earlier might have been used as an impromptu sail. More on that later. During the night of June 11th, 12th, 1962, 3 inmates successfully fled Alcatraz, although it's unclear if they survived their escape attempt. Prison officials assumed the 3 drowned in San Francisco Bay or else were swept out to sea. I'm not sure that was the case, though. In recent years, many of those who have studied the escape believe that a couple of the escapees, if not all 3, made it to safety. Some of the escapees' family members are all but certain they survived as well. For those not familiar with the case, the 3 escapees were John W. Anglin, age 32, of Montgomery, Alabama; John's younger brother, Clarence Anglin, age 31, also of Montgomery, Alabama; and Frank Lee Morris, age 35, of New Orleans. On the day after the escape, the San Francisco Chronicle published a story that was titled, "How to Recognize 3 Escapees." Here's how the paper described the 3 men. John William Anglin, age 32, height 5 foot 10 inches, weight 140 pounds, blue eyes, blonde hair, medium build, a small scar on left cheek, round scar on left forearm. Clarence Anglin, age 31, height 5 foot 11 and a half inches, weight 168 pounds, hazel brown eyes, brown hair, Zona tattooed on left wrist, Nita on right forearm. Frank Lee Morris, age 35, height 5 foot 7 and a half inches, weight 135 pounds, hazel eyes, black hair with these tattoos, devil's head on upper right arm, a star on each knee. The one on the left has a 7 above and an 11 below, a star at the base of the left thumb, the number 13 at the base of the left index finger. The 3 escapees had a combined weight of 443 pounds. Perhaps you're thinking, why is that important? Well, if you're trying to escape Alcatraz on a homemade raft, the weight of those in the raft is an important factor when determining your safety and success. According to the FBI, the escapees used more than 50 raincoats to make 4 Mae West-style life jackets and a raft that measured about 6 feet by 14 feet, with 15-inch pontoons around the edges. The investigation revealed that at least 52, and perhaps as many as 55, of the prison-issued raincoats were missing. Apparently, for building the raft, the inmates consulted an article they found in a copy of the November 1960 issue of Popular Mechanics. The magazine was found in John Anglin's cell following the escape. It included an article titled "Rubber Geese," which discussed vulcanizing rubber. In Frank Morris's cell, the investigators found a May 1962 issue of Sports Illustrated with an article about rubberized boats. Also found in Morris's cell was a March 1962 issue of Popular Mechanics with an article about life preservers. It's thought that this article was used by the escapees to fashion the 4 life preservers from the prison raincoats. The escapees constructed plywood and pine paddles that were just under 4 feet in length. The paddles were needed to propel the raft in the desired direction, a plan made difficult by San Francisco Bay's prevailing winds and tidal currents. The paddles look rather flimsy to me. I question whether the escapees made good their escape using only these crude paddles with which to power their raft. Depending on the currents when they shoved off, and assuming the flimsy paddles didn't break, it may have been possible to reach the shore, but it would have required a Herculean effort on the part of the paddlers. But why would Morris and the Anglin Brothers spend a year planning their escape and not anticipate the need for more than a few flimsy paddles? I keep thinking about all those canvas raincoats the escapees stole from the prison, and I keep thinking about my own raincoat that blustery day on Angel Island. I ask myself this: might they have used the 55th Raincoat as a makeshift sail? And if they did, might that have made a difference? A sail could have been hoisted using one or more of the paddles, or perhaps they had some other way of hoisting a sail that we're not aware of. Or might one or more of the trio donned a raincoat themselves, opened it to the wind, and created a sail of themselves? Does that sound far-fetched? Before addressing that question, let's examine some of the background information pertinent to the escape attempt. On June 13th, it was reported that a raft made of the raincoats may have allowed the inmates to reach Angel Island. At the time, there were reports that a raft was found on the island the morning after the escape. Indeed, a report notes that a raft was spotted by the crew of a Coast Guard helicopter on a beach at Angel Island, and that a second raft was spotted at the Standard Oil Wharf at Point Richmond. Military and Bureau of Federal Prisons personnel searching Angel Island on June 12th observed the raft on the beach. The raft was noted in their report, as was the fact that footprints were observed leading away from it. However, the FBI claimed that their agents found no indication that either of these rafts had been used by the inmates. I find it interesting that the authorities initially reported that a raft was found on Angel Island. Soon after, it was reported that the raft was not the one used by the escapees. And then a day or so later, the raft reported from Angel Island is described as having been a fishing net. And while the sighting of a raft on the island was reported by the press immediately following the escape, within a few days they too reported the official version that it was just a fishing net. Might that be evidence of a cover-up? I'll address that question later. On the night of the escape, between 11 o'clock p.m. and 2 o'clock a.m., the winds were out of the southwest at 5 to 8 knots. That's about 6 to 9 miles per hour for non-sailors. The tide was outgoing at about 2 knots, beginning around 10:30 to 11 o'clock p.m. It started to come back in at about 5 a.m. The inmates were last seen in their cells at 9:30 p.m. on June 11th, and they were discovered missing from their cells at 7:18 a.m. on June 12th. The prison alarm was sounded soon after they were discovered missing, and the search began. Sunrise the morning of June 12th was at 5:47 a.m. It seems logical that the escapees would have attempted to make landfall in darkness before the first light of day. They would have had an available window of darkness of approximately 7 hours, from approximately 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. to reach land. The currents just after 10 p.m. on the night of the escape would clearly have carried a free-floating object out through the Golden Gate, 2.5 miles to the west. 2 days after the escape, the Oakland Tribune reported that the currents on June 12th, between the hours of 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., were still. And according to the San Francisco Chronicle, the ebb tide was 2 miles per hour at the time of escape. The paper described the current as being in a quote, a fairly mild tide, end of quotes. In another story, the Chronicle reported that the ebb and flood tides were unusually mild the night of the escape. These were stories that the Chronicle published the first 2 days following the escape. Once J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI got more involved and the official story became more controlled, the news stories reflected the change. News coverage began to focus more on the likelihood that the inmates had perished, whereas before they were considerable speculation that they had survived. Apparently, the press just took the FBI's word for it, that Alcatraz was inescapable. And why wouldn't they? A few years ago, a program on NPR claimed that the tides and winds the night of the escape were strong. I've seen similar statements elsewhere. If the official line is that the escapees perished in the bay or were swept out to sea, then it's necessary to overstate the conditions. Still, or even mild currents just don't cut it. The tides and winds must be stronger if the public is to believe the story that the escapees all perished. And that's just what J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was suggesting, that the 3 escapees had perished. Alcatraz was inescapable. End of story. Prison guards claimed they saw the escapees in their cells at 9:30 p.m. If true, that means that they escaped sometime after about 10 p.m. The water temperature in San Francisco Bay was 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit that night. That means that hypothermia would have set in within about 20 minutes or less for anyone not in the raft. At the time of the escape, the Coast Guardsmen said there was little likelihood that the escapees, if they reached the water, tried to get to San Francisco. They noted that tides and currents were unsuitable for fleeing to San Francisco, but not for escaping northward to Angel Island or the Marin Headlands. It's possible they didn't head toward Angel Island or the Marin Headlands, though. Interestingly, Robert Cecchi, an off-duty San Francisco policeman, observed a white boat sitting stationary between Alcatraz and San Francisco just before midnight on the night of the escape. He reported that the boat sat idle for about a half hour. Then someone aboard the boat shined a flashlight into the water as if searching for something. Soon after, the boat left the area, headed for the Golden Gate. There are some who believe that the escapees were picked up by a boat in the bay and whisked away to freedom. Some claim there was a mob connection to the escape attempt. Of course, it's not clear if the white boat was involved in the escape or not. While I think it's possible, such a scheme as that would have required elaborate coordination and communication by the escapees with someone on the outside. Given the level of security at Alcatraz, I don't see how the prisoners could have communicated with people outside the prison to the degree that would have been necessary to arrange such a precisely timed boat rescue. Unless, of course, they had a guard or other prison employee assisting them. I've seen nothing to suggest that was the case, though. It would have been standard operating procedure for both the Bureau of Federal Prisons and the FBI to have looked into the background of any prison employee who might have been in a position to assist in the escape attempt. As far as I know, such background checks turned up no suspects among the prison staff. On June 12th, investigators used a Piper Cub and a Stinson airplane to search Angel Island. They also had 2 40-foot-long Coast Guard boats search the island's coastline. I watched a TV program a few years ago that featured an interview with a man who claimed he was part of the June 12th search party. He said that they definitely found a raft on the beach at Angel Island. He said that searchers saw footprints leading away from the raft and water. A few years ago, as mentioned earlier, a law enforcement bulletin was uncovered which said as much. But a few days after the escape, the San Francisco Chronicle reported that the soldiers found no clues when they searched Angel Island. The official story had somehow been changed. Perhaps as a result of the raft and footprints that are said to have been found the morning after the escape, 35 military police officers from the San Francisco Presidio were sent to Angel Island later that same day. According to a June 13th story in the San Rafael Daily Independent Journal, 3 families were evacuated from Angel Island on the night of June 12th, as the military searched the island and MPs patrolled the island all night. The next day, the MPs were joined by 134 soldiers from the 561st Engineering Company. Under the supervision of a squad of FBI agents, the soldiers conducted an inch-by-inch search of the 760-acre island. This was after an inmate by the name of Allen West informed prison officials that the three escapees intended to raft to Angel Island. From there, he said, they planned to walk their raft around to the other side of the island and then continue on to the Marin County mainland. West told the authorities that the escapees planned to leave debris to make it appear that they had drowned. Allen West is known to have been a conspirator in the escape planning. According to West, he was supposed to be the fourth member of the escape attempt, but he was unable to get out of his cell in time. While he undoubtedly knew the escapees' plans, it's not certain that he was forthcoming with the authorities. His story about Angel Island may have been a ruse to throw the searchers off. I suspect he was telling the truth, though. Later in life, West claimed to have been the mastermind of the escape attempt. I find that highly doubtful, though. I have little doubt that it was Frank Morris who possessed the intellect and skill to create such a plan. And, unlike West, Morris managed to make it to the raft. West didn't. At 10:15 p.m. on June 13th, a paddle was found off Angel Island. It was seen floating 100 to 200 feet off the shore and in about 30 feet of water. This was halfway between Point Stewart and Point Knox, two of the island's landmarks. The paddle was homemade and just under 4 feet in length. It was similar to a paddle that had been found on the prison cell block roof following the escape. At 1:15 p.m. on June 14th, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers debris boat named Coyote found a pouch with a packet of photos and addresses. The pouch was floating midway between Alcatraz and Point Blunt on Angel Island. The pouch was made of material cut from a prison raincoat. Many of the photos inside the pouch were of Anglin family members. It's thought that the pouch belonged to Clarence Anglin. On June 15th, a Mae West-style life preserver of the kind used by the inmates was found on Fort Cronkite Beach in Marin County. A search of the beach also turned up a blanket which resembled those used at Alcatraz. That couldn't be confirmed, though. Prison staff examined the blanket but were unable to positively identify it. Soldiers searched the beach but found nothing else. On June 22nd, a life preserver was found floating in the water 300 feet east of Alcatraz. According to the FBI, it resembled the one found at Fort Cronkite, as well as the one the escapees left behind at the prison. But perhaps the most intriguing clue involved a ship heading out to sea. The Norwegian freighter SS Norfell left Pier 38 in San Francisco a month after the escape attempt. On July 17th at about 5:45 p.m., two members of the ship's crew, a first mate and the quartermaster, are said to have seen what they believed to have been a human corpse floating in the ocean about 20 miles northwest of the Golden Gate Bridge. This sighting occurred 5 weeks after the Alcatraz escape. Using binoculars, the two crew members observed a body floating belly down, with arms and legs dangling down and with the buttocks up. The floating corpse appeared to have been wearing full-length dirty white pants. The FBI reasoned that the dirty white pants they cited may have been a pair of denim pants issued to prisoners. They noted that pants like these are known to fade and turn white when exposed to salt water. 3 months later, when interviewed by the FBI, the two crew members were unable to verify that the pants they had observed on the corpse were the same as the blue denim trousers issued to prisoners. They noted that they had observed the body from a distance, using binoculars. The freighter was headed to Vancouver, Canada. According to an FBI report, the ship lacked a transceiver capable of broadcasting on the marine radio bands used in the U.S. The ship continued on to Canada, and from there it went to Auckland, New Zealand, before returning to San Francisco. As the ship was departing San Francisco on yet another voyage, purportedly on August 8th, one of the ship's officers told the San Francisco bar pilot that a body had been sighted on July 17th. I find this very problematic. First of all, it's implausible that the ship could have spotted a body 20 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge on July 17th while en route to Vancouver, and from there continued on to Auckland before returning to San Francisco and then departing again on August 8th. This implies that only 22 days were required for all this activity. In the early 1960s, a typical freighter voyage from San Francisco to New Zealand and back would have taken closer to 48 days. When you include the time it took to travel to Vancouver and back and to unload and load while in port, in both Vancouver and Auckland, that makes the trip a minimum of 56 days. I cannot explain the 3-week voyage mentioned in the FBI's report for a voyage that should have taken 8 weeks. There's another thing I find implausible about the ship's sighting. It seems like the ship's crew would have been well aware of the much publicized prison escape when they spotted the body on July 17th. So why didn't they make more of an effort to report their sighting? They could have reported it once they arrived in Vancouver, or later when they reached Auckland. Surprisingly, they didn't even report the body when they returned to San Francisco. Apparently, it was through a remark one of the ship's officers made to the bar pilot in San Francisco that led to the authorities being alerted. Apparently, the bar pilot passed the information on to the Coast Guard, who in turn notified the FBI. But by then the ship was at sea, not to return to a U.S. port for a couple of months. In 1962, the port of San Francisco was a busy place. There would have been other ships plying the waters of the bay and immediately off the coast. Why didn't the freighter's crew radio some other ship with an appropriate transceiver and request that they contact the authorities? According to the FBI report on the incident, the crew noted that there were no other ships in their area when they sighted the body. But that seems implausible to me. And they claimed that they lacked a radio capable of communicating with U.S. ships and port facilities. If that was really the case, how did they gain entry to a U.S. port like San Francisco? The ability to communicate with port authorities is a U.S. maritime requirement. It wasn't until October, after the ship had returned to the U.S., that the FBI finally had an opportunity to interview the ship's crew. By then, 3 months had passed since the 2 crew members had spotted what they thought to be a body. Perhaps the crew of the freighter did in fact spot the corpse of one of the escapees. Or might it have been some other kind of flotsam or jetsam? A lot of things flow in and out of San Francisco Bay. If truly a corpse, might it have been the body of some other person? Perhaps an unknown jumper from the Golden Gate Bridge. For example, could the corpse have been that of Seymour Webb? Seymour Webb was a 33-year-old African-American man. On the night of June 11, 1962, he parked his car mid-span on the Golden Gate Bridge and leaped to his death. Apparently, he was despondent over a failed relationship. Webb was observed by numerous witnesses leaping from the bridge. This would have been about the same time, or just before, the 3 inmates were pushing off from Alcatraz in their homemade raft. Although the Coast Guard responded quickly to the report of Webb's bridge jump, his body was never recovered. The Anglin Brothers had moved from Donaldson, Alabama, to Ruskin, Florida, when they were just boys. Ruskin is a town on Tampa Bay between Tampa and Sarasota. What I find most interesting is that the Anglin Brothers liked to make rafts when they were growing up in Ruskin. In an interview with the Oakland Tribune, just a few days after the escape, the mother of John and Clarence Anglin noted that when her 14 children were growing up in Florida, they were always in and around the water. She said that John and Clarence were fond of making rafts. This suggests that the Anglin brothers were avid boaters, and perhaps even accomplished raft builders. Imagine that. The interview with their mother paints Ruskin at the time as having been a tiny farm community where almost everyone learned how to swim in salt water before they could walk. Boats were common in the area, including sailboats. The paper said that with few exceptions, almost everyone in town boasted a boat in their backyard. And it went on to say that there appeared to be little doubt that the Anglin boys were good swimmers. Contrast this with what Fred Wilkinson, the assistant director of the Bureau of Federal Prisons, was quoted by UPI as saying just 4 days after the escape. He said, "The only swimming those fellows were accustomed to was in the little old creeks in the swamps of Florida and Louisiana." He also said, "The tides and winds that night were strong. The convicts were not the athletic type." Wilkinson felt certain that the 3 inmates had drowned in San Francisco Bay. He said that it would have taken an athlete to make such a swim. Wilkinson appears to have been unaware of the raft thought to have been used by the escapees. Or perhaps he was of the impression that the raft was nothing more than a fishing net, as had been reported by the FBI. Or perhaps he was just spinning a yarn, as directed by Hoover, who the FBI's records indicate was clearly upset with Wilkinson for having already talked so freely with the press. I found little evidence to indicate that Frank Morris knew much about being on the water, but he certainly wasn't suicidal. He was intelligent, with a reported IQ of 133. So why would he have gone to all the trouble of planning the escape only to go and drown in San Francisco Bay? I don't think he did. I suspect that it was Morris who developed the escape plan, probably with considerable input from the Anglin Brothers and from Allen West. It's likely that it was the Anglin Brothers who took the lead on designing the raft. I suspect they also determined how to get it off Alcatraz and over to Angel Island and or the Marin mainland. To do so, they had to cross perpendicular to the outgoing currents. Depending on when they shoved off, paddling may have been enough. But I'm thinking they might have used a makeshift sail in addition to paddles. I think this because of the Anglin Brothers' first-hand knowledge of boating on Tampa Bay and the observations they undoubtedly made of watercraft plying the waters of San Francisco Bay. There's something funny about how Alcatraz Prison was designed. In the exercise yard, there are steps leading up to the door to the cell house. Adjacent to the steps are rows of low concrete bleachers like the ones you might find in an amphitheater or coliseum. Inmates from the prison's general population were allowed to use the exercise yard for 2.5 hours on Saturdays and Sundays. A review of the historical photos depicting the exercise yard indicates to me that Alcatraz inmates really enjoyed sitting on those bleachers, especially the uppermost rows. From the higher rows, inmates had a commanding view of the yard. They also had an expansive and exceptionally pleasant view of San Francisco Bay and of all the boats plying its waters. Some of those boats had sails. In Clint Eastwood's 1979 movie, Escape from Alcatraz, there are scenes of his character sitting on the upper bench. I watched the movie again recently, and it got me to thinking. From the camera's perspective, stationed somewhere just behind Eastwood, you can clearly see San Francisco Bay over the security wall. If Eastwood could see the bay, then the inmate he portrayed could too. That character was Frank Morris. You're probably thinking, so what? Well, given the Anglin Brothers' knowledge of building rafts and their time spent on the water, they likely sat up there with Morris on those upper bleachers taking in the scenery. If so, they probably studied the behavior of the bay. It seems likely that they would have tried to study the waves and currents and determine the tides and prevailing winds if they were planning an escape. I think you'd want to do that if you were hatching an escape plan that involved crossing San Francisco Bay. You'd probably want to make use of any opportunity to read the waves. Now, I realize that growing up on the water in Florida is a far cry from having grown up in Polynesia, where generations of islanders learned to read the waves, a useful tool when navigating the open sea. Perhaps in similar fashion, the Anglin Brothers had enough water sense to watch San Francisco Bay from day to day and calculate the bay's daily fluctuations in terms of the currents and wind. These kinds of observations, even if only made several times a week, might have helped inform their escape plan. Although certainly not as numerous as today, there were plenty of sailboats on San Francisco Bay in 1962. This included the bareboats, unique sloop-style yachts designed and built to sail on San Francisco Bay. From the vantage point of the upper bleachers, Morris and the Anglin Brothers could have observed sailing craft plying the waters of the bay. That observation might not inform most inmates, but I sense it would have been informative for the Anglin Brothers, perhaps for Morris too. With the brothers being water-wise and Morris exceptionally bright, their escape plan may have been plotted in the uppermost bleachers. There was a rumor that the Anglin Brothers may have killed Morris in order to lighten the load in the raft. The rumor appears to have begun 9 days after the escape, when Bureau of Prisons Assistant Director Fred Wilkinson speculated for a reporter that the raft may have sunk. And if it did, he said, I'd know who'd go overboard first. This was the origin of a rumor that continues to this day, that the Anglin Brothers killed Morris and escaped without him. I doubt the Anglin Brothers would have killed Morris, though. They needed him, and if they did drown him, where's his corpse? Apparently 2 out of 3 drowning victims are recovered from San Francisco Bay. What are the odds, then, that all 3 of the escapees, if drowned in the bay, would have gone unrecovered? It's possible, but I believe it's mathematically improbable. I don't know if the statistics include jumpers from the Golden Gate Bridge or not. If so, are those who jump on the outgoing tide factored in, and do they represent most of those not recovered? In other words, the 1 out of 3 who are not recovered. Or to put it in a different way, are most of those who drown in the bay recovered, and it's primarily the bridge jumpers on the outgoing tides who aren't? An episode of the popular Mythbusters that aired on the Discovery Channel back in 2003 asked a question: did 3 prisoners in 1962 build a raft out of raincoats and use it to escape from Alcatraz? The host, Jamie Hyneman and Adam Savage, tried to solve the mystery. They made a raft and used it in an attempt to get away from Alcatraz. Their raft consisted of 3 pontoons shaped like a triangle, with the sides measuring 14 feet and 14 feet and 6 feet at the back. The bottom was made with over 30 raincoats. In this Mythbusters episode, the host went to the bay model in Sausalito and determined that the bay currents would have taken the escapees right out through the Golden Gate, and it would have done it quickly, providing the raft was unpowered. But with paddles, the hosts managed to get their raft to the Marin Headlands, just inside the Golden Gate. They hypothesized that the escapees could have made it to the Marin Headlands, and once there, released their raft and belongings, which then washed up on Angel Island. This might have been done to throw off the authorities. According to their logic, the raft might have arrived at Angel Island without the escapees aboard, if they had already made it to the Marin Headlands, and then released the raft as the tide was coming back in. 5 years ago, there was a second attempt to model bay currents from the night of the escape. This was done by Rolf Hutt of Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. He had seen the Mythbusters episode and desired to get a better handle on what the water conditions would have been like the night of the escape. Hutt created a computer simulation model that attempted to determine if the inmates could have made it safely ashore from Alcatraz. He discovered that under certain circumstances, they could have made it. Furthermore, Hutt found that to have succeeded, the escapees would have had to have launched their raft between 11 o'clock p.m. and midnight, and that they would have had to paddle perpendicular to the current. That would have put the escapees on the beach at Horseshoe Cove. Horseshoe Cove is located on the Marin Headlands just inside the Golden Gate, but Hutt's model indicated that to have survived, the escapees would have had to have paddled properly. If they just went with the flow, they would have been carried out through the Golden Gate and into the ocean. But imagine if the raft had a makeshift sail. I suspect it would have made a difference. Remember that Tom Hanks movie, Castaway? His character used part of a portable outhouse as a sail and allowed his raft to power over the big waves that surrounded his island prison. Of course, that was just Hollywood, but it illustrates that in a pinch, industrious and clever people find a way to overcome adversity. Or, as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. So, if Hollywood can envision a portable toilet used as a raft sail, I can certainly propose a canvas raincoat. J. Edgar Hoover had wanted a prison that was escape-proof. Alcatraz was supposed to be that prison. It had been transferred from the Army to the Federal Bureau of Prisons in 1934. Supposedly, when Alcatraz was made a federal prison, Hoover had touted the rock as being inescapable. Morris and the Anglin Brothers proved him wrong. Alcatraz was expensive to operate, as everything had to be shipped in, and the concrete walls were crumbling due to constant exposure to salt water. When the 1962 escape proved that it wasn't escape-proof, that spelled the beginning of the end for Alcatraz. It was closed just 11 months later. But first, the rock witnessed one more escape attempt, and it was this one that spelled the end for the prison. On December 17, 1962, the San Francisco Chronicle reported on the attempted escape of 2 prisoners from Alcatraz, one of whom swam all the way to San Francisco before being captured. The Chronicle reported that the successful swim from Alcatraz to San Francisco, and I quote, destroyed once and for all the official position that escape from the federal prison is impossible. And then the Chronicle went on to say, and I quote once again, and it added strength to the supposition of sailing men who know the waters of San Francisco Bay, that other escapers have made it safely to shore. That alluded to Morris and the Anglin Brothers. When the FBI closed their Alcatraz escape case in 1979, they had 14 volumes on the 1962 escape, each with thousands of pages. They officially handed the case off to the U.S. Marshals Service. According to the FBI, the escapees perished the night of escape. They claimed that no one could have survived the night on the bay. As for the U.S. Marshals Service, they considered it an open case, and they're still seeking leads. The case will remain open until all 3 men turn 99 or are proven to be deceased. Leads come in from time to time, and most of them originate in what might be best described as left field. but every now and then a lead arrives that's worth checking out. For example, 2 years ago, the San Francisco Chronicle obtained a copy of a letter dating from 2013. The letter claimed to have been written by John Anglin. It had been sent to the San Francisco Police Department. How the letter was handled by the police when it arrived in 2013 is unknown, nor is it known how the Chronicle obtained a copy of the letter in 2018. The letter claimed that all 3 of the escapees had survived their escape attempt. John's brother, Clarence, and Frank Morris had lived to be old men, but were now gone. John, if that's who he really was, claimed to be suffering from cancer. He offered to turn himself in if the authorities would publicly guarantee to only incarcerate him for a year and allow him to get treatment for his cancer while he was locked up. No such agreement was made. The FBI checked the letter for fingerprints, but their analysis was inconclusive. Nothing more was heard from the letter writer. The Anglin family believes the letter is authentic, though. Years earlier, someone had provided the Anglin family a photograph he claimed to have taken of the Anglin Brothers in Brazil in 1975. Later, the photograph was subjected to intense scrutiny by the FBI, but it too proved inconclusive. Unfortunately, the 2 men in the photo were wearing sunglasses, which made it impossible to confirm their identities. But the consensus appears to have been that the photo was likely authentic. If the Anglin brothers escaped Alcatraz and were living in Brazil in 1975, then it's conceivable, perhaps even probable, that the author of the 2013 letter sent to the San Francisco Police Department was indeed John Anglin. That letter was probably a lead, but it doesn't appear to have led anywhere. In 2013, I thought that I too had found a lead to the 1962 case, but mine didn't lead anywhere either. On the south side of Angel Island, not far above the beach thought to have been the escapees' initial destination, something was found that puzzled me. A workmate of mine found, and then promptly lost, an item that might possibly have shed some light on the case. I won't go into what was found, but suffice it to say it caught my attention when I learned of its discovery almost a week later. By then, the object had been misplaced. Without the benefit of having the physical item to analyze, I was forced to try and reconstruct a chain of events that might explain how the object had come to be found, where it was found. The location of the object seemed out of place for something like it, and that puzzled me. The object was found a good ways up the slope from the beach where the raft had supposedly been found in 1962. Interestingly, this is also where the final scene in Clint Eastwood's Escape from Alcatraz was filmed. Some years ago, I had the pleasure of working with Clint when he was a member of the State Park and Recreation Commission. I took him on several state park tours, and on one occasion I drove him about for the better part of a day. I wish now that I had thought to ask him what he thought about the escape. To play the role of Frank Morris, he would have obviously been aware of the facts. I wonder what Clint thought about it. But let's get back to the object I was telling you about. I conducted interviews with the 2 colleagues who had seen the object, and then I spent a day on Angel Island with an assistant, scouring the surface where the object had been found. I was unable to locate anything of interest, and I wrote a report saying as much. Because I had thought that the object might possibly have been associated with the 1962 escape attempt, I sent a copy of my report to the local office of the U.S. Marshal Service, since the case was technically still open. I did not receive a response, but of course I hadn't expected one, given my negative findings. In the end, I had to write the mystery object off. It had been found and then lost, and it didn't seem to have been associated with the escape. I tell this story now only to illustrate how leads continue to come in regarding this world-famous case. So what do I think? Well, I believe the 3 escapees made good their escape. I really do. They might have made it to Angel Island, or perhaps they landed on the Marin Headlands just like the folks from Mythbusters suggested, a scenario that the modeling of Rolf Hutt also concluded to have been possible. And it's possible they were whisked away to freedom by that mysterious white boat. One thing I feel pretty certain of is that they didn't all drown in the bay, nor were they swept out to sea. The facts don't seem to support such a fate. You know, there's a science to what happens to your body when you drown. Some people know this, including forensic anthropologists, county coroners, and other such investigators who work with the decomposition of human remains. But most of us don't know much about that. When you drown in an open body of water, you will sink soon after drowning. and your corpse will remain submerged for several days, or in some cases, for a couple of weeks. It depends on a variety of things, the most important being water temperature and body gases. Cold water can slow the formation of internal gases, inhibiting buoyancy. Providing you don't get caught up in some underwater obstacle, like vegetation, debris, and rock outcrops, your corpse will eventually rise to the surface, courtesy of the internal gases that are at work inside your corpse. One of the coroners told the FBI that due to the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, drowning victims there tended to surface after 8 to 15 days. Surfacing is a result of the decomposition process. Your body will swell until it looks bloated, like a human balloon. After surfacing, your swollen corpse will float for days, possibly even weeks. But unless recovered, it will eventually sink, never to be seen again. Eventually, the bones of your skeleton will be all that remains of you, and even your bones will in time become separated and scattered. In regard to the sighting reported by the crew of the Norwegian freighter, the FBI said that local county coroners confirmed that it was not uncommon for a corpse to float on the water's surface for as much as 5 weeks, that being the amount of time between the Alcatraz escape on June 11th and the sighting of what was thought to be a body on July 17th. Interestingly, the Coast Guard told the FBI that bodies tended to float down the coast from the Golden Gate. The alleged body spotted by the freighter's crew was observed 20 miles northwest of the Golden Gate. From June 12th to June 22nd, Coast Guard helicopters with FBI agents aboard had patrolled San Francisco Bay and the coastline about 20 miles north and south of the Golden Gate. None of the escapees' corpses were recovered from the bay. If they all drowned the night of the escape, where did their bodies go? It's highly unlikely that all 3 drowned in San Francisco Bay, and even more unlikely that all 3 of their corpses got hung up on underwater obstacles, never to be seen again. Nor can I picture all 3 corpses having washed out to sea while submerged. If all 3 men had drowned in the bay, you'd think that at least 2 of the bodies would have been recovered, like the models suggest. And yes, perhaps that alleged corpse reported by the freighter crew was in fact a human body, but we can't be certain that it was one of the escapees. Perhaps it was Seymour Webb, the man who leapt to his death from the Golden Gate Bridge the same night the escapees were entering the water. But for the sake of argument, if the floating corpse spotted off the coast was indeed one of the escapees, as the FBI seemed to suggest, then once again I must ask the question, what became of the other 2 bodies? I'm still puzzled by the fact that the crew of the freighter failed to make more of an effort to contact the authorities after seeing what they thought to be a human body in the water. The delay in reporting causes me to wonder if they were uncertain of their sighting. It seems a bit odd to me, and convenient too. Might this have been part of a J. Edgar Hoover cover-up? J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI in 1962. In fact, Hoover was the FBI in 1962. And as those old enough to remember those years will likely recall, Hoover had a powerful personality and what some might call a rather large ego. Years earlier, when Alcatraz was made a federal prison, apparently Hoover proclaimed it to be escape-proof. Now he was faced with the embarrassing situation of explaining how Morris and the Anglin Brothers managed to escape the inescapable rock. From the start of President John F. Kennedy's administration in 1961, Hoover and Bobby Kennedy were at loggerheads over changes Kennedy wanted to see at the FBI. Hoover was focused on continuing his long-standing program of domestic surveillance, especially that which focused on what he perceived to be a communist infiltration. He even had Kennedy's friend, Dr. Martin Luther King, in his sights. For his part, Kennedy desired to see the FBI focus more on organized crime. The 2 men did not see eye to eye on this, and by 1962, their differences had grown problematic for Hoover's agency. Kennedy was supposedly Hoover's boss, but he didn't seem to be in a position to rein him in. The Alcatraz escape was undoubtedly an embarrassment for Hoover, and it's conceivable that he felt it could be used against him. A review of the declassified FBI case files that are currently available to the public suggests that an intense manhunt was underway, and it didn't let up for years. While the FBI was proclaiming that the escape had failed, their secret investigative actions proclaimed the opposite. It's clear to me that the FBI investigators felt it reasonably likely that one or more of the prisoners had made good their escape. So why tell the public they all drowned? I believe it's likely that Hoover ordered a cover-up of the Alcatraz escape. I say that because I believe I see a change in the tone of the official statements put out by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies soon after the escape. In the first couple of days following the escape, officials from the Bureau of Federal Prisons were up front with the press and members of the public. They reported what they knew. In some cases, they reported too much, and this angered the FBI. This was especially the case after a prison official told the press about the pouch of documents found floating in the bay. The pouch belonged to the Anglin Brothers, and in addition to family photos, it contained names and addresses of people the FBI assumed the brothers would contact if they survived their escape attempt. Daylighting this information to the press might have impacted the investigation. Furthermore, the press was growing agitated with the officials from the Bureau of Federal Prisons for what they felt was the dissemination of contradictory information. There was also a growing call to close Alcatraz Prison by local politicians. In a series of memos between Hoover and his San Francisco agents, it was decided to try and pressure the prison officials and to stay in quiet. As for the FBI, there would be no press conferences or official comments made to the press. Mum was the word. But the story was already out of the bag, or rather on the front page of the local newspaper, and Hoover didn't like that. Whereas the initial statements that were released by the Bureau of Federal Prisons officials on the first day of the search mentioned a raft being found on Angel Island, with footprints leading away from it, within a couple of days that raft was said to have been a fishing net. And whereas police officers in the Central Valley were advised to be on the lookout for a blue 1955 Chevy Auto stolen in Marin County around the time of the escape, later accounts would claim that there were no stolen cars in Marin during that time. There are other inconsistencies too. Some may be coincidental, some may not. It seems that the U.S. military and the Bureau of Federal Prison Authorities went to great lengths to locate the escapees that first day or two following the escape. But once Hoover and the FBI assumed command of the chase, the official story appears to have changed. In time, the FBI proclaimed that the three escapees had all drowned in San Francisco Bay, or else had washed out to sea. That seems convenient to me, and I believe it's statistically improbable. That's why I suspect a cover-up by Hoover. In a recent interview with CBS Atlanta, David Widner, a nephew of the Anglin Brothers, attested to an FBI cover-up. He said that the FBI was embarrassed at not being able to find Frank Morris and his uncles, so they tried to change the story by convincing the public that the three men had drowned in San Francisco Bay. Widner said that he has no doubt that his uncles and Morris escaped. Another thing Widner said is that when he was growing up, there were always FBI agents watching his family and listening in on their calls. If J. Edgar Hoover was convinced that the three men had drowned in the bay, why would he allocate such resources to watching members of the Anglin family for year after year? I think that's telling. If John Anglin's still alive, he'd be 90 years old. I'd love to ask him about that 55th Raincoat. Did he and his companions use it to sail away to freedom? While I suspect he did, I doubt we'll ever know. After all, some mysteries have to go unsolved. And we all enjoy a good mystery, don't we? That's where legends are born. As the legendary filmmaker John Ford once said, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend.